Remaining Bali Nine are reunited with their families in Australia's Sydney in the end. The Australians returned to their country as they'd left it, without fanfare on a cheap commercial flight. But the youthful faces that had once been splashed on the front pages of tabloids were now weathered by 20 years in Indonesian prisons. And their numbers were diminished. The Bali Nine was now down to 5. But this week, they were finally home. Scott Rush, Matthew Norman, C.E. Chen, Martin Stevens and Michael Zugaj, who were serving life sentences for their roles in a 2005 heroin smuggling scheme, arrived back on Australian soil after Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto agreed to their release on humanitarian grounds. Photos of the men completing paperwork in Bali showed 5 middle-aged men, barely recognizable as the teenagers who had gone on a free trip almost 2 decades earlier. By Friday, after health checks at a former military quarantine facility, the 5 had rejoined their families, according to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. But there was no official welcome, no press conference, no tearful reunion photos. Shrouded in secrecy, their return brought to a close one of Australia's most infamous cases, which inflamed relations between the neighbouring countries for years. The Bali Nine just dominated how we saw Indonesia and what we talked to our kids about, said Madonna King, a journalist and co-author of a book on the case. Many Australians thought, "There but for the grace of God could go my kids. Why would teenagers do this to understand the Bali Nine case? You've got to go back a bit further to 2004, King said, when a young Australian woman was caught at Bali's main airport with 9 pounds of marijuana in her boogie board bag. Schapelle Corby's claim that she had been set up startled Australians, many of whom were learning about Indonesia's strict drug laws for the first time. There was a strong sense among many in Australia that she might have been innocent, that she could have been any of our daughters, King said. 6 months later, 9 more Australians were arrested in Bali for attempting to smuggle out heroin. Australians realised by that time that drug offences carried the death penalty, King said. So there was a sense of, why would young adults or teenagers do this and risk that? Adding to the case's resonance, the 8 men and 1 woman looked like modern Australia. They hailed from different backgrounds and classes. Some had been born overseas. Some came from struggling households, and others were relatively well off. Some were pulled into the scheme at the last minute. Zugaj and Rush claimed they'd gone out drinking in Brisbane just a few days earlier when a stranger, Tan Duk Ton Nguyen, bought them drinks and offered them each about $4,000 and a trip to Bali. "I just jumped straight in," Zugaj told Australia's 9 network from his jail cell shortly after his arrest. Zugaj said he didn't have a clue what was in the package later strapped to his body. "Stupid me." Rush's parents claimed they'd realised something was wrong and asked the Australian Federal Police to stop their son from going to Bali. They soon learned he'd gone and had been arrested. The Australian Federal Police tipped off Indonesian authorities about the men's plans, according to local reports. The agency came under further criticism for helping Indonesian police, despite Australia's policy of not aiding in death penalty cases. When Rush's parents visited him in jail, they took him a Bible and jelly beans, a firing squad, an outcry and a secret release. The case quickly became a source of friction between the 2 nations, whose relationship was already strained, partly because of the terrorist attacks in Bali in 2002 that killed 202 people, including 88 Australians. Bali had been a playground for young Australians, King said. But after the arrests, some cancelled vacations or took extra precautions. Australians became a bit paranoid, she said. John Howard, Australia's Prime Minister at the time, opposed the death penalty for the Bali Nine, rankling officials in Jakarta. When Australian lawyers called for the Nine's extradition, an Indonesian judge warned Australia not to interfere. The Bali Nine were convicted and sentenced in early 2006, with 7 of them receiving either life or 20 years in prison. The alleged ringleaders, Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran, were sentenced to death.